You must love podcasts if you're listening to this. Do you want to start your own one or you already have one? Then follow Smarter Podcasting to get expert advice from me, Neil Mackay, the podcast guy. Since 2019, we've worked with over 40 podcasters, produced over 700 episodes, and helped many podcasts get to the top of the Apple Podcast charts. And right now, I'm offering you a professional edit for just $27. Click the link in the show notes. Welcome to the latest episode of Smarter Podcasting. I'm Neil Mackay, the podcast guy and founder of 7 Million Bikes Podcasts. I work with podcasters around the world to help them share their story and connect with their audience. So are you interested in creating your own podcast but don't have a lot of money to spend on equipment? Then you're in luck, because today I'm going to be talking about how to record a podcast on a budget with Brian Biedenbach from Summit City Studios and the host of Good Podcasting. Brian interviewed me for Good Podcasting and we discussed our experiences starting and growing our own shows, and we talk about the equipment and recording setup that we use, our approach to interviewing guests, and the challenges we faced while producing our podcast. A massive thank you to Brian for letting me share this episode on Smarter Podcasting with you. Make sure you go check out his show, Good Podcasting, and follow it as well as Smarter Podcasting to help you take your podcast to the next level, wherever you are right now in your journey. A barrier for many people to start a podcast is the belief that it requires expensive or complicated equipment, but that's simply not true, and I am proof of that. I started my first podcast in 2019 with a 2010 MacBook Pro, the free software that's included called GarageBand to edit, and a Blue Yeti USB mic that I bought for $100 that broke after one season and is still sitting in my cupboard to this day. I have this hope that it will magically repair itself and start working again, maybe one day. I didn't have a studio, headphones, a good laptop, or even much knowledge of what to do, but I was passionate about my subject and excited to share the stories of my guests. You're about to hear in this episode with Brian how I was able to go from there to creating a podcast that has been listened to around the world, just broken 50,000 downloads, and is in the top 10% of podcasts worldwide. I now produce 3 of my own podcasts and make shows for people around the world, from the Netherlands to Vietnam, the UK, and the US. With a little bit of creativity and some smart purchasing decisions, you too can create a high-quality podcast without breaking the bank. In fact, many successful podcasts have been recorded on a shoestring budget. So if you're ready to learn some tips and tricks for recording a great podcast without spending a lot of money, then stick around. I'm going to share with you everything you need to know to start a podcast on a budget. By the end of this episode, you'll be well on your way to creating a fantastic podcast that will engage and entertain your listeners. And remember, you can join my online course to gain the skills, knowledge, and confidence to create, produce, and market your podcast to the world if you're just getting started. The link is in the show notes, or go to 7millionbikes.com. Let's get started. If anyone's thinking, oh, we're doing an episode about podcasting on a budget, this guy's definitely Scottish, it's true.
Hey everyone, Brian here. You see, my guest today, Neil Mackay, runs 7 Million Bikes. It's a podcast production company that operates out of Saigon in Vietnam. It's an amazing story. I can't wait to share that with you. Let's jump into today's episode of Good Podcasting with Neil Mackay from 7 Million Bikes. Hey there, and welcome to Good Podcasting, the show designed to help you create, launch, and grow your podcast. My name's Brian, and today I have a guest literally from the other side of the world. I'm really excited to introduce you to Neil Mackay, the podcast guy. Let me tell you a little bit about him before I bring him on. He's a podcast host, he's a producer, and he's founder of 7 Million Bikes, which I'm excited to learn more about today. And now he's starting a business to help other people start their podcasting journey. Very similar, we talked beforehand, to what we're doing here on Good Podcasting. Let me introduce you to Neil Mackay, the podcast guy. Neil, welcome to Good Podcasting. How are you?
I'm very, very good. Thank you so much for having me on. Awesome introduction.
Yeah, well, you know, it's been fun. Like, again, we talked for just a few minutes before recording, and it's been fun getting to know you. People might be a little confused when I would tell them that you are in Vietnam and they hear, is that a Scottish accent?
Yeah, I'm a Scotsman in Vietnam via the US, then Australia, then New Zealand, then Vietnam. So
you've been all over the place.
Yeah.
Where do you call home at this point then? Is it Vietnam?
For the longest time, it was still New Zealand, but now it is Vietnam. Yeah, we're kind of Vietnam's home for the moment, but it's not permanent.
Sure. Okay, so all the places you've traveled, have you picked up little bits and pieces of accent from every place? Because I hear it really strong Scottish, and I didn't know, like, when you talk to people back in Scotland, are they like, what happened to your accent?
Yeah. The last time I went home, I saw my best friend, grew up with him, hadn't seen him in years. And as soon as he walked in, I was like, hey, Gary, how are you doing? Good to see you. And he looked at me and he said, you don't need to talk to me like I don't speak English. And because living in Vietnam, I am very used to speaking to non-native speakers who do speak English, but it's their second language. So I slow everything down. You have to downgrade your language in terms of what you say, like the vocabulary you use and the grammar you use, just to make sure that people can understand you. But even, after living in the States, you guys cannot hear accents. Like when I lived in America, I would walk up to people and, I'd say things like, hey, how you doing? What's the weather going to be like today? And they'd be like, yeah. That's not the answer to that question. Like, it's not a yes or no answer. So that was really common.
I think sometimes we're just caught off guard by the accent, and we're like, I don't know what he said, but that sounded beautiful. And we just kind of
they love
dumbfounded.
the accent. Yeah, they love the accent. Absolutely love it, but don't understand it at all. And America is such a big country. You don't have a huge amount of accents. You're not, because in Europe or in the UK, you just hear accents left, right, and center. Whereas in America, you don't really get exposed to that many accents.
Yeah.
So when people would hear mine, they would just, one, get really excited, and two, have no idea what I was saying. So I would have to, even in America, and even now I teach English, I have to put on an American accent when I teach a lot of the times, because some of the words I say, like last week. See, I just slipped between American and Scottish there. Last week, I said to my students, add up the total. What did I say? Sometimes I can't even understand what I'm saying. I said, add up the total. And my students looked at me with a blank face. And I was like, the total, add it up. And the student was like, and I was like, oh, total. Add up the total. And I put on an American accent. And as soon as I put on an American accent, they're like, oh, the total. Oh, okay.
No, it's funny. We have more dialects, really. Like we have slight little things. The way we say words in Wisconsin is different than it is I grew up in Cincinnati, and the way I say things, my wife's like, that's totally like in Cincinnati. But I'll tell you, man, when we hear an accent like yours, it's either, oh, he's either from England or Australia. Like that's all we know. Man, we could talk about accents all day.
All day.
Probably we shouldn't, since we're talking about podcasting today. Tell us, you've got a couple podcasts going on, right? Tell us a little bit about which one you started with, and then kind of how that developed.
Yeah, so what happened was, obviously a massive podcast fan. It goes all the way back to, which American listeners probably maybe not too familiar with, but like way, way back when it was actually on an iPod before smartphones and everything, I listened to the Ricky Gervais Show, which was with Stephen Merchant, Carl Pilkington. It was the biggest podcast in the world. Podcasting had it was just at the birth of modern podcasting anyway.
That was kind of the first real big one, wasn't it?
That was the first big one, yeah.
Yeah, I think I remember reading that recently.
Yeah, it was huge. I remember at the time they're like, this is the biggest podcast in the world. It went crazy. I mean, if you've ever now seen Carl Pilkington's become kind of famous in his own right for shows like An Idiot Abroad and things like that. So always into podcasting, would listen when I was commuting. And then I did some research on this a while ago. And then now recently, after what's happened, my research has been confirmed that it was the Serial podcast with Adnan Syed about, the kind of true crime podcast. Now he's been recently been released from jail. And I'd read articles that backed up what I had thought was that really was the watershed moment. And if you even look at Google Trends, podcasting had declined And then I think it's 2014 when that came out, it shot back up. So that really like reinvigorated podcasting was the Serial podcast. So I'd always been a big fan of the medium, listen to podcasts all the time. And then my wife and I, our schedules changed. So we used to always have the same days off. And then suddenly she was working and I had a Sunday to myself. And so I was just really bold. And, here in Saigon, there's not a huge amount to do. There is if you look for it. But one of the most popular pastimes is just drinking beer because it's so cheap here to drink beer. And I didn't want to do that all day by myself on my day off. So I just kind of, one bold Sunday, I was like, I should start a podcast. And what it was, being a teacher here in Saigon, you meet lots of different English teachers. And they there's this almost like a phrase, like people say, I'm just an English teacher. What do you do here? I'm just an English teacher. And I found that really like disparaging because the more I learned about just an English teacher, they all had something else. Like, they were either like a designer or a singer or an artist or a leather maker, one guy was, or a comedian. And so I was like, I want to get to know these people. I want to share their stories about who they really are more than just an English teacher. And so that's kind of where it started from. I was like, right, I think probably like most podcasters, you're like, I'll start a podcast. And then you're like, oh, what do I do? Like, how do I do that? Right. So, I had to research all the things that you need to start a podcast. And so that from there, then that started. It was originally called a Saigon podcast. 7 Million Bikes, a Saigon podcast, which was a really large name. And 7 Million Bikes came because I just read an article saying that this will blow your mind. Saigon has about 10 million people, and there at that time were over 7 million registered motorbikes in the city. So it's got one of the highest. Yes.
Okay.
Just if you go out here, there's just motorbikes like everywhere, left, right, and center.
That's how people get around.
Yeah, I mean, cars, this is a growing economy. So in the 6 years I've been here, cars are more prevalent and more normal. But still a heck of a lot of motorbikes. So 7 Million Bikes, I was like, that's a fun name. So I came up with that. And then so the initial goal was to interview people in Saigon. And then just through natural evolution, I started to interview guests overseas. That were Vietnamese American or Vietnamese Swiss, Vietnamese German. I got introduced to some really cool people. And so and then I looked at the listenership, and the listenership was in America and in Hanoi, and it was not just based in Saigon. So after I think a year, I changed the name to a Vietnam podcast to be more reflective. And then a little bit later, I dropped the 7 Million Bikes, and that became more of the overall brand. So it was like a Vietnam podcast by 7 Million Bikes rather than 7 million. Because as well, you're learning all the time. And I think somebody said to me, 7 Million Bikes doesn't really mean anything. Like it's not, as a podcast, it's not obvious what the show is about. It's
sure.
Kind of a little internal joke for me. I like these quirky things. So I dropped that. And then, and it just kind of like, it didn't blow up like, top 1% of podcasts in the world. But like, and then again, I'm sure you've maybe talked about this before. You see the most common question podcasters always ask is like, how are my numbers? Like, what should I be aiming for? What's a good show?
Right.
And I had the same thing all the time. I was looking at my numbers and I'm like, I have no idea what these mean. Are these good? And then eventually I found some stats and I was like, wow, I'm in like the top 10 to 20% of podcasts in the world. Like these are great numbers, like for, which we're probably like, I think my biggest episode is over 500 downloads. Generally though, it's pretty consistent, which I've always been proud of. Like I see people post about how they get really inconsistent numbers. My numbers have just always been like clockwork, like between 150. Yeah. Normally about 150 to 200. In the first 7 to 14 days, which is another thing I try and tell people. It's the first 7-day downloads is really all you need to be looking at. So it was good. So then once I realized that it was doing really well and I was like, wow. And then, the over the last year or so, especially, I meet more and more people that are like, oh, I listened to your podcast, which still blows my mind. I have this really weird thing. I don't know if you have this where we sit and we make this thing. And right now it's just me and you talking. Right. There's no one else around us. And then we put it out to the world for people to listen to. Right. And then I get surprised when someone listens. I'm like, wait, oh, you listen? Oh,
you too. And it's
I'm like,
not
oh.
mom. It's not my mom, you know?
Yeah, exactly. So like, yeah, even to this day, when I meet someone, they're like, oh, hey, I listened to your podcast. I'm like, oh, you listen to me? That's so weird.
Yeah.
You hear how much you know so much about me. Like I talk about my wife a little bit, not much, but like she comes into the conversation. Like, you know a lot about my life. And
Yeah. I think so. Not to cut you off there, I want to hear more, but I do think you hit on a really important point that I try and tell people as they're starting podcasts is, as you develop your content's one thing, but your listener gets to know you. Like the content gets them there, but it's really you and your personality and your voice that, you talk about. You're real, you're authentic. You talk about things that are going on in your life, and they get to know you, and they want to hear the way you think, what you think about the next thing, or they trust you. I liked the last 3 guests you brought on. I'm going to like this next one, right? And so they get to know you because all they do is hear your voice. And that's why I love this medium too. It's, people feel connected with you as the host simply by your voice, no matter what accent you're speaking in, right?
Yeah. And it's something I struggle with still because, so I never started this to be quote unquote famous. I didn't do this to put myself out there. I did this to share stories of people. And my goal has always been to put the guest front and center. So if you look at a Vietnam podcast, you won't find my picture at all unless I was the guest. And there's a couple of episodes where I've switched roles and been the guest, but it's always the picture of the guest on the front of the episode. I've always promoted them. If you look at any of the content I put out, like the mini content, things like this, it's never me. It's always the guest.
Mm-hmm.
And then over time, I realized exactly what you just said there. I realized that people are tuning in for me because I'm 50% of it. I mean, to be honest, when I interview someone, I'm probably speaking 10% of the time, right? So that was the other thing. I'm not talking all the time. I'm presenting the guest. But like you said, yeah, people are tuning in to hear me and my voice and hear what I have to say.
Now you've done the Vietnam podcast, and that's people, you're interviewing people who have been connected to the country specifically. Is that correct?
I wanted to share with you about one of my favorite affiliate partners, and that is Fiverr. I've been using Fiverr for years for everything from ordering YouTube thumbnails to keyword research, writing podcast articles, even to Canva designs and thumbnails and more. So whether you're a budding entrepreneur, a podcaster, or anyone in between, Fiverr has got you covered. It really is the go-to platform if you want to find freelancers offering a massive range of services to help you on any project. Maybe you need a stunning new logo or just a short animation. Whatever you need, you can find it on Fiverr. What I love the most is how easy Fiverr makes it to connect with talented freelancers from around the world, all at prices that will fit whatever your budget is. Plus, with Fiverr's secure payment system, you can trust that your transactions are safe and secure. No dodgy people you meet on Facebook groups that disappear with your money and never give you what you want. What, that's only happened to me? As an affiliate partner, I will get a small commission if you use the link and at no extra cost to you. As an affiliate partner, I will get a small commission if you click my link and you buy something, all at no extra cost to you. And best of all, you will be directly supporting the making of this podcast that you're listening to for free, but it is not free to make. So why wait? Head over to somewhere that you've probably never been before. It's called the show notes. So whatever app you're listening in, if it's Spotify or Apple Podcasts or anything at all, head to the show notes, click on my special link, and then you can browse thousands of gigs ready to help you with your next project. Yeah, I mean, and that was something that developed over time. Originally, like I mentioned, it was a Saigon podcast. It was just people who lived here. And then as it developed, you're always trying to, and learning as well from people like Pat Flynn. And you're like, well, what is the point of this? What is the hook of this podcast? What is it about? So that kind of eventually became, I realized, okay, so this podcast shares stories of people connected to Vietnam, which then encompasses expats like myself. It encompasses Vietnamese Americans who live overseas, who've never lived in Vietnam, but they have a Vietnam story to share. I've interviewed Vietnamese Swiss people. So sharing stories of people connected to Vietnam means that I can talk to anyone, but the premise is they have to have a connection to Vietnam.
You have a second podcast. You said you're a comedian as well. That's another side gig or main gig that you do. And I think your other podcast, I haven't had a chance to listen to that one very much yet. But I forget the name of it, but it's a comedy podcast, correct?
Okay. Yep, that's right. So that one's called Did That Really Happen? And so not long after I started doing podcasting, then I started doing comedy, and then that kind of snowballed as well. So that was part of the kind of 7 million bike story. I started doing events and comedy and stuff like that as well. And so I think this will be quite interesting to you and your listeners. This was and still is a bit of a side project. And the main goal with this one was, how quickly can I make a podcast?
Okay. You were just trying to do it fast.
Yeah, because a Vietnam podcast, I spend so much time making the editing perfect, the sound, I go through so much to try and make it, hit every mark, the intro, the main bit, the outro.
Right.
I had the music made by my friend. I did a lot of, I did and I still do a lot of promotion online on social media. And basically, yeah, it was just like, how quick and easy can I make a podcast? And then, so the concept is, before I ever started doing comedy, I'm sure most people are the same. When you hear a comedian tell a joke on stage, whatever the story is or how crazy it is, I would always think, did that really happen? And when I would meet comedians after the show, sometimes I would often meet them and I would be like, did that really happen? And most of the time the answer was yes.
Huh.
And the comedians would just be like, there's no way I could make that up. Like, I'm not that creative. Like, and I realized about my own comedy as well. One of the things, mostly what I do as well, is maybe something, just one tiny thing happens, and then you're like, okay, I can make a story from this. And then 3 things happen, and then you put them all together, and suddenly you have a joke that comes from there. So I just loved the concept, and I wanted to do a comedy podcast. It was kind of because I was doing comedy shows and podcasts again, just thinking all the time. I'm like, right, how can I bring these 2 things that I love together? And then I was like, oh, a comedy podcast.
Let's talk for just a moment about, you mentioned your microphone and trying to figure, that's kind of the first step for a lot of people, right? Is I want to start a podcast. What do I need to do that? And so when I started, I've told the story a number of times on this podcast, so I won't go into it, but we just bought the cheapest microphones we could find, the cheapest mixer we could find, knowing that we probably didn't even need that. And we learned how to use it because I invited a co-host that I thought knew how to do all that stuff, and he didn't. And so he and I were both learning along the way. So what did you start with? And have you outgrown that stuff? Or are you still using the same microphone and headset and all that stuff?
Yeah. Man, thank you so much for having me on. I get so excited to talk about this stuff. It's so weird, isn't it? You're like, wow, yeah, I'm excited to talk about this. No, so yeah, almost the exact same. I'm Scottish. We have a reputation for being cheap. That is a very true reputation. I'm very cheap. I try and do things for as cheap as possible. I don't like spending money. I don't like investing money if I don't have to, especially if you're starting something like a podcast. I'm not, I see some people post all their equipment and I'm like, where do you get the money for all of this? Like, I don't have like the money lying about to just go and spend $500 on a mic and a mixer and all of this stuff. So it's always, and even to this day still, it's like, how can I make this? This has always been my mantra. How can I do this as good as I can with the budget that I have, which is generally not very much. Right.
Yeah.
So I started off with and also at this point, and I'm going to mention him a few times, I need to give a massive shout out to my friend, Lewis Wright. So he's actually a music producer, audio engineer. Very fortunate to meet him here in Saigon and become friends with him. He has literally held my hand through every step of the way. Even today, like, he's helped me out, which we can talk about challenges. He's helped me out with a challenge like today. And this is 3 years after we started. So
man,
I probably wouldn't be anywhere. I wouldn't even be making podcasts without him. So a massive, massive thank you to Lewis Wright. So I started with a Blue Yeti, GarageBand on my MacBook. He came over, he set up all the dials on it, all the hair. I have no idea what he was doing. He set up everything to try and make it sound as good. He taught me the thing that I still learn to this day is cover all the shiny surfaces. Audio bounces off the walls and the windows and the floors, and so you want to try and make it sound. Again, we're just recording in my front room, so it's not a studio. It's just let's try and make it sound as good as we can with what we have.
And the Blue Yeti picks up a lot.
Which I didn't realize. I didn't know anything about microphones at the time.
Yeah, I didn't either when I bought mine, and that's why I'm not using it right now.
I'm not using mine because it broke and I've never been able to get it fixed, but that's another matter.
Okay.
So, so we recorded and him and his wife came over and I was like, well, let's do a test episode. So I interviewed her. She's Vietnamese, but she'd lived in the UK for 7 years. And that was my first time ever interviewing someone. And I really enjoyed it. I think one of my skills as an interviewer is being able to ask kind of difficult questions without like, it's never like a gotcha moment,
right?
But I'm prepared to ask like something that's maybe a little bit tricky. So for her, like I remember, for example, it was like, did you ever experience racism in the UK while you were there? You know, what was that? What did that look like? What happened? So we did a test in the living room with the Blue Yeti. And then I was like, right, now let's go test it in the bedroom. So me and Lewis moved into the bedroom. We put up, like you guys call them comforters, right? Like I call them a duvet. Yep, you guys call it a comforter, right?
Yep.
We put up comforters all over the window, all over the place. We put pillows up, everywhere. We just sat across from each other. We put the Blue Yeti closer, and we just did both of those episodes as a test. And they were so interesting and I enjoyed them so much. I learned so much about my friends that I didn't know. They actually became episodes. So you can go back to season 1. I think those were episodes 2 and 4, I think, if I remember off the top of my head. So then I went from the Blue Yeti to, again, massive shout out to Lewis. He then loaned me his Zoom H5 audio recorder. Which you can plug XLR mics into, but I was just using the capsule mic at the top. It's like the bi-directional mic like that. And so, again, just trying to do good mic technique, set it up between us and trying to make it sound as good as it can. But it wasn't great, but it was fine. I went back and listened to some episodes. I was like, oh, geez, that audio sounded bad, you know. And I mentioned to you before, there was one episode where I'm pretty sure the microphone wasn't connected. So this would be my big tip to anyone, like do a test, because this episode was so interesting. And then when I went to listen to it, the audio was garbage. And I was like, I think that's picked it up on the laptop mic. And this was 3 years ago on a 10-year-old MacBook. So it's not like today, the mics probably would be not too bad on your laptop, but my mic was like garbage. So the whole episode was just awful audio. But then, I moved to the Zoom, and then, over the lockdown period that we had during the pandemic, I just moved to a headset because I was doing all my interviews on Zoom, and we can talk a little bit about Descript and DAWs, and I started using Descript, and I found this headphone was just not this headset, but the headset I had at the time was just lying about in the house, so I just started using that. It was comfortable on my ears. It was so cheap. I could tell it was cheap. But the mic was fine because it was close to my mouth. And then when I would edit it, the sound was good. So I was like, I'll just use this. I later Googled the brand. It was like a $5 headset.
Oh, my word.
Yeah. And it was the audio was fine, you know, and I was like, wow. And then it was once we came out of lockdown, that's when I really started to, and again, not even invest, borrow mostly. And again, shout out to Lewis. Like this is his microphone I'm using right now.
Okay.
He would just, because he's an audio engineer by trade and music producer, he has all this equipment that he doesn't use.
It's good to have friends like that.
Yeah, so it's also like, you know, there's not a real need for me to go out and buy all this equipment when he's got it lying there not being used, and he's happy for me to use it. Like if I wasn't using this right now, it would just be sitting in a box in his room. So he's been just, honestly, I need to tell him to listen to this. I cannot thank him enough for everything he does, everything he helps me with. He's shown me how to use all the equipment. And even now, I still don't really know that much. I have to message him all the time. Like,
did you have any, not to cut you off, did you have any experience with it beforehand, before you started podcasting? No experience with audio editing? Okay.
Zero. Absolutely
me
nothing.
Neither.
And
and look at us now.
So that's I know. And in the last couple of days, I've had that kind of imposter syndrome with I've finished this course and I'm like, what have I done? Why have I made this course? I spent 9 months making it. Who am I? Like, even meeting people like yourself, and I read a bit about your website and your bio, and I'm like, man, this guy knows way more than me. Like, I should not have a course. Like, what am I doing? But I do remember the motivation to start it was, like we talked about, someone who, like me 3 years ago, who knew apps, there are people who know zero. And my motivation was, okay, I don't know everything. I don't know everything about everything, but I know a lot, and I've learned a lot, and I know enough to share. And so that was the motivation is, okay, I'm going to put down what I know into a course and then share that with people. So now, just to go back to what I said, just do it for as cheap as you can, the best you can. One thing I say in my course as well, it is a journey. You'll get better over time. Maybe your budget will increase. You can buy a new microphone.
Right.
The biggest thing is to just do it. Don't wait until you have everything. Don't wait until you have the perfect studio and all the perfect equipment.
Yep.
Get started. There's a little bit of me, I'm, an environmentalist at heart, that why would I buy something new if it already exists and I can borrow it? Like,
right.
let's not consume and create more products when we don't have to, you know? So there's a little part
it's
of me
almost
is
like you don't live in the United States, Neil, because I feel like it's a different attitude here.
Yeah, maybe. I think so.
Maybe so. Let's talk about some of the challenges you faced. And I know we're kind of running out of time here, so we don't have a ton of time, but as a podcaster, there's always challenges. What are some of the challenges that you've faced that you've learned the most from in this journey of, what'd you say, the last 3 years or so?
3 years, yeah. I mean, yeah, equipment is one. Just last weekend, I went to set up the microphones before I recorded my client, and one of them wasn't working, and I had to, troubleshoot it. Message Lewis. I was like, what's happening here? Like, I sent him a video. I was like, why is this not working? Eventually figured out the cable wasn't working, which was the last thing I expected, that the cable wouldn't work, but that was it. And it made me realize, I think in any industry, you're paying for experience. So if someone hires you or hires me, it's a shortcut, right? Because you only figure these things out with experience because you've made the mistakes. Right. And then you're like, oh, that's what happened last time, so this is probably what it is this time. So equipment is always a challenge. Even just a few episodes ago for a Vietnam podcast, I didn't press record on the audio recorder, which is my worst nightmare. Like every podcaster's worst nightmare. Thankfully, I had recorded it on my camera. I'd set up a tripod with my camera.
Okay.
So I don't really post on YouTube, but again, for the micro content, I just take these little clips and post them. But the sound quality, obviously, on your phone, which is about 3 feet away from you, isn't as good. So that was a massive challenge, was then trying to make that audio listenable. And that was just a nightmare. Like, it was just such a nightmare. I thought I'd solved it. I thought the audio was good. Then I shared it. I shared the teaser, and my wife she's one of my super fans. She listens to every episode. She messaged me. She's like, I couldn't listen to that. It was so bad. I was so had to unpublish it, go and fix it again. So as soon as we come off this call, I literally had this, it's what I need to try and fix this. I couldn't, like, in my sleep last night, I'm like, how do I fix this? So these are the kind of challenges and the problems that you have on an ongoing basis, I think. But it's fun as well at the same time.
I've also recently not recorded an episode, so I feel your pain there. I was teaching, just real quick story, was teaching a podcasting course, like a 2-week unit at a local high school here in our area. And to end the course, every student was like writing about one of their most memorable, life-changing moments in their past. And I got to interview them, right? Well, we were recording into GarageBand on an iPad, because that was the devices they have in the school. And I've never really edited or used an iPad, GarageBand on an iPad. So I was teaching myself at the time. So this kid tells this gut-wrenching story of when his dad left when he was just a little kid, and tried to come back into his life when he was a teenager, and just all these painful memories. And I looked at the iPad and I went, you know what? I am so sorry. We hit record, but one of the settings, it only recorded like the first 15 seconds of his whole story. And I went, man, I hate to do this to you. Are you willing to tell your story again? And it was only 5 minutes. I did. It was only 5 minutes. These were really short episodes. But I'll tell you what, man, as a side note to that, he told me, like, I think podcasters have to be good storytellers. I think it's very similar. I was picking this up as you were talking about your comedy too. I think comedians and podcasters have to be great storytellers. And so that was one of the things that I picked up from him too, is he told me the facts the first time. And the second time, he went into great detail about what he remembers about what his dad was wearing when he walked away that first. And I was like, oh, this is so great. Like, I'm sorry you had to tell this, but the story just got really, really real in that moment. So anyway, all that to say, that was my most recent failure. And I feel your pain about not recording and, the audio stuff. Well, Neil, it's been a pleasure talking to you today. I love what you're doing. I love your humor. I love the fact that you are helping others do what you love to do. And I think that's a passion we share, just being passionate about something and wanting to teach others how to do it. So thanks again for being on here. Where can people find you? You mentioned your email address, neil@7millionbikes.com. Where else can people find you on social media?
Yeah, well, you go 7 Million Bikes Podcasts, and then also just go to the website. I'm really proud of that. That was a lockdown project for me, my friend. He's like, I'll help you. I'll build a website for you. And I was like, oh, cool. And then he basically just made the empty shell. It's like someone giving you an empty house and then like a brick house with no paint, no nothing, and be like, hey, I made a house for you. And you're like, okay, but now I have to do everything to make it a house. So I had to learn how to build a website, basically. But that's evolved as well, but I'm really proud of that. So go to 7millionbikes.com. You'll find the blog on there, links to the shows, links to the course, things like that. So that's the easiest way to get in touch.
Fantastic. Neil, thanks again. This has been a pleasure. Neil Mackay, the podcast guy. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. It's been amazing. I really appreciate it. Thank you for listening to this episode of Smarter Podcasting by Good Podcasting and Brian Biedenbach. So massive thank you to Brian for having me on this show and then letting me share that with you. I hope it helped break down any barriers you have about starting a podcast, gave you some inspiration to start one, or even any helpful information if you already have one. If you do want to start your own podcast but don't know where to start, then join my online course, How to Start Your Podcast, Get Your Voice Out and Share Your Story. I'll take you from a podcast beginner to an expert in just 1 week. With step-by-step guidance, personalized support, and a community of like-minded podcasters, you'll gain the skills, knowledge, and confidence to create, publish, and grow a successful podcast. You will get a podcast masterclass and 23 tutorials and over 3 hours of video content covering everything from the fundamentals of podcasting to audio editing, what podcast equipment to use, and social media marketing so your new podcast will build a loyal audience. The course will also include guidance on how to monetize a podcast and potentially turn it into a profitable business. You'll also get a whole host of extras, including templates for show notes, a prep form for guests, and checklists for software. This is an amazing podcast course for beginner podcasters. The link is in the show notes, or go to my website, 7millionbikes.com. My goal is to provide you with insights and knowledge on a wide range of topics, and I appreciate your support. So please feel free to leave a review, let me know what you think, and don't forget to subscribe for future episodes. Thank you again for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next episode.
Hi, my name is Sal Jeffries. I run the Mindset, Mood and Movement podcasts. I've been working with Neil at 7 Million Bikes for the whole of this year, literally from the start of my podcast to date. And I want to say a couple of things. So when we record the podcast, sometimes there are things that I need tweaking. There could be edits or clips. It's really simple. I give those instructions to Neil, he gets it sorted. There's sometimes a sound level differences between the guest mic and mine. Again, that's all sorted so the outcome is a really balanced sound. And also if there are issues with voice, little kind of sound interruptions, all those things that can distract a listener, Neil knows exactly what to do, cleans it up. The end result, a highly professional, beautiful sounding podcast without distraction. That's exactly what I want. I know my listeners do. So if you're interested in having that level of podcast and that kind of quality, Neil is a great guy and I highly recommend you speak to him.